The snow pressed itself against the little cabin like a relentless hand, whispering through the cracks in the boards, moaning in the chimney, as if some ancient spirit had been trapped there. Evelyn Carter sat close to the iron stove, her knees drawn to her chest, wool blanket pulled tight, watching the last curls of flame lick at the wood. The world outside had gone white and merciless again. Winter was not simply a season on the frontier. It was a judge, a thief, a reminder of how small a body could be against the earth's indifference. For 3 years she had lived alone. No mother to guide her needle, no father to sharpen the plow. Fever had taken them both one winter, and the town, more curious than kind, had left her to fend for herself. They whispered about her in the mercantile. Poor girl, too proud to beg, too quiet to marry. She had learned to stretch silence like cloth, patching it over the holes loneliness tore in her. Her only companions were the fire, the kettle, and the sorrow that moved like a shadow in her chest. She moved with practiced stillness, careful not to waste energy. Each gesture had the patience of ritual. Feeding the fire with one more stick, mending the fray on her sleeve with thread pulled from a rag, folding and refolding her father's old coat, though it no longer smelled of him. Her hands were cracked, nails blunt, skin raw from the lye soap. In the small square of mirror by the bed she sometimes glimpsed her face, paler now, cheeks hollowed, eyes carrying the ache of someone much older than 20. That night, the storm grew so loud she could not hear her own breath. She leaned her head against the log wall, letting the groan of the wind fill her ears. She closed her eyes and whispered, as she sometimes did, to no one at all, "If there is mercy left in this world, let it find me." The words did not echo. They sank, heavy, into the wood around her. Then came the knock. It was not timid. It was the strike of a fist against the planks, deep and commanding, 3 times. Evelyn's whole body jolted, as though the sound had risen from beneath her. She froze, staring at the door as the shadows from the stove flame quivered across it. Her heart beat so hard, she thought it might break the silence with its thudding. No one ever came here. Not in storm, not in snow. A second knock, slower this time, shook her out of stillness. She rose, bare feet finding the cold floor, and took the lantern from the table. Her hand trembled so much the light shivered across the cabin walls. With each step toward the door her mind conjured terrors. Outlaws, wolves on 2 legs, men from town with harsh laughter and colder intentions. She pressed her lips tight, praying her voice would not shake if she had to send them away. She lifted the bar and pulled the door open a sliver. 2 giants stood before her, shadows against the snowlight. They were Apaches. She saw it at once in their hair, their bearing, the hard beauty of their faces. Both were bare-chested beneath buffalo hides draped across their shoulders, skin marked with old scars that gleamed under the lantern's sway. Snow clung to their braids, their lashes. Their breath came like smoke in the bitter air. The nearer one, broad as an oak, spoke first. His voice was low, careful, as though each word cost him something. "One night. Fire." He placed a hand against his chest, then gestured to the storm behind him. His companion stood silent, his eyes narrow with caution, studying her like a hawk studies a trembling rabbit. Evelyn's throat tightened. She gripped the doorframe to keep herself from swaying. Every tale the town had spun about Apaches flooded her mind. Raiders, thieves, killers of settlers. And yet here they stood, not storming, not demanding, but waiting. The snow fell harder around them, a curtain of white swallowing the horizon. Her fear tangled with something else she did not want to name, an ache that came from too many nights without another soul's presence. She could shut the door, bolt it, pretend the knock had never come. Yet already the cold from outside had swept around her ankles, and already the stove fire was burning low. The man spoke again, slower, his eyes steady on hers. "One night." Her hand, without asking permission, pulled the door wider. The wind shoved inside, carrying flakes that stung her face. The 2 men stepped in, ducking their heads, and suddenly the cabin seemed half its size. Their shadows stretched tall across the rafters, their bodies radiating heat even through the bitter air clinging to them. Evelyn backed toward the stove, clutching the lantern as though it were a shield. The taller one, he must have stood near 7 feet, shut the door with care, then removed the buffalo hide and laid it across the chair near the fire. His companion followed, silent, his eyes still fixed on her with unreadable weight. The silence was a living thing, pressing against her chest. She set the lantern on the table, trying to keep her hand steady. Her breath came too quick, too shallow. She saw her patched dress, her uncombed hair, her hands red with work. Shame rose in her like heat, for she felt herself laid bare before them, fragile as glass. The big one moved to the hearth and crouched, feeding the fire with the wood stacked there. Each motion was measured, deliberate. He did not glance at her. He only gave the flames what they needed, as though it were his right to tend them. When the fire leapt higher, spilling light over the room, Evelyn saw his face more clearly. Scar down his jaw, eyes dark as storm clouds, expression carved from stone. The other man, leaner, with a hawk-like nose and lips pressed tight, unstrapped a rawhide pouch and set it carefully on the floor. He sat cross-legged near the door, his posture one of guarded watch, as though ready to leave at any instant. Evelyn sank into the chair opposite the fire, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. She wanted to ask their names, why they had come, where they were bound. But the words stayed trapped in her throat. Instead she watched the way their presence altered the air itself. The storm outside still howled, yet inside there was a new weight, a tension she could not define. For 3 years, the cabin had known only her silence. Now it held the silence of 3, thick and electric. The fire popped. A log split, sending sparks up the chimney. Evelyn flinched, then caught the gaze of the scarred one. For a moment their eyes held and she felt something shift. Her fear did not vanish, but it bent, reshaped into something sharper, more dangerous, awareness. She turned her face away, staring at the snow creeping in under the doorframe. But her heart refused to quiet. Outside, the storm clawed at the roof. Inside, 3 strangers, alone no longer, listened to the fire, each one waiting for what would come of this night. The fire burned higher now, throwing restless shadows against the log walls, yet Evelyn still felt the cold beneath her skin. The 2 men filled the room as though the cabin itself were too fragile to contain them. She busied her hands with the kettle, setting it near the coals though there was little left inside but thin broth. Her father's old tin cups trembled in her grip, and she hated the sound of it. The scarred one, she thought of him as the taller, did not look at her. His gaze stayed on the flames, heavy and unyielding, as if he could wrestle warmth from them with his silence. The leaner one, seated nearer the door, seemed carved from stone. His dark eyes followed her with a wariness that made her chest tighten. She had endured years of whispers and watching eyes in town, but this stare was different, colder, sharper, and yet not cruel. It was as though he measured her worth against something unseen. Shame crept up her throat like smoke. She saw herself as they must see her. A girl alone in a cabin too empty, wearing a dress patched so many times it was more thread than cloth. She tugged her shawl closer, but the holes in it betrayed her poverty. What had she become? A ghost who swept the floor for no one, cooked meals for silence, stitched clothes that no eyes admired. She poured the broth into the cups, thin steam curling like a frail promise, and placed them on the table. The tall one rose, his movements slow, deliberate, and took one without a word. His scar glistened in the firelight. He lifted the cup, sipped, and gave a small nod, though whether in thanks or merely acceptance she could not tell. The leaner man did not move until she pushed the cup closer, her hand stopping just short of his. His gaze flickered from her face to her trembling fingers. Then he took it, careful not to touch her skin, and drank with the stillness of a man guarding a secret. Her own cup sat cooling by the stove. She could not bring herself to drink. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and let the silence swell. It pressed against her ribs until she thought it might break her. Then the tall one stood, ducked beneath the lintel, and opened the door. The storm rushed in, stinging her cheeks with snow before he closed it behind him. She moved to the window, lantern light spilling across her shoulder, and watched him stride into the night with an axe in hand. His bare arms glistened with melting flakes as he bent to the woodpile. The rhythm of his work cut through the howl of the wind. Each stroke sent chips flying, his breath fogging the air. She should have turned away, but she could not. He was a silhouette of strength against the snow, a figure carved from something elemental. Neither holy man nor holy beast, but both. For the first time in years, she felt the strange pulse of safety, though she could not name why. When he returned, carrying an armful of split logs, she stepped back quickly, ashamed of being caught watching. He stacked the wood neatly by the hearth, his hands efficient, leaving no sign of pride in the labor. Yet she knew what it meant. He had given her back fire, back breath, back life. Her throat thickened and she managed a whisper. "Thank you." He did not answer. He only returned to his place by the flames, shoulders gleaming, eyes shadowed. The leaner one shifted then, as if restless. He glanced at the broken chair in the corner, its leg splintered, a wound Evelyn had not had the tools to mend. Without asking, he pulled a strip of rawhide from his pouch and worked it around the crack, his fingers swift and sure. The binding was tight, clean. When he set the chair upright again, it stood steady. He looked at her then, not long, not kindly, but as though saying, "See, it is done. You need not ask." Evelyn's eyes burned. No man had lifted her burdens in years. Each day she had carried them like stones, quiet and uncomplaining. To see strangers, men she had been told to fear, mend her world with their hands was almost unbearable. Gratitude pressed against her shame, until the two became one indistinguishable ache. She set bread on the table, rough and coarse, the last of her flour stretched thin. She placed it between them, her hands lingering as though the act itself was a plea. The taller man broke a piece and handed it to his companion, before taking his own. The leaner one ate slowly, his eyes never softening, but he accepted it. When Evelyn tore off a piece for herself, her fingers brushed the tall man's by accident. His skin was hot, startlingly so, like iron pulled near a forge. The touch lasted no longer than a breath, but it rattled her, left her pulse skittering in her ears. The firelight flickered, painting their faces in gold and shadow. Evelyn sat across from them, tasting the bread though she could not swallow. She watched them chew in silence, their movements quiet, reverent even, as if food was not simply sustenance but a fragile covenant. Later, when she lay on her narrow bed against the wall, she could not close her eyes. The two men slept on the floor by the fire, their breaths deep and steady. She watched the rise and fall of their chests, the way the firelight softened their harsh features. The cabin, once filled with nothing but her own lonely breath, now held the sound of others. It was unfamiliar, unsettling, and yet it filled some hollow she had not known how to name. Her shame lingered, whispering she was foolish, reckless, sinful to share her roof with men she did not know. The town's voices echoed in her skull, cruel and certain. She'll come to ruin. She'll be no better than Wild herself. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to quiet the thrum beneath her ribs. But beneath the shame was another voice, softer, steadier. "You are not alone tonight." Snow hissed against the stove. The fire cracked inside. Evelyn turned on her side, facing the wall, though her gaze lingered on the flicker of flame. Sleep would not come. Something had shifted, something she could neither welcome nor resist. As her eyes grew heavy, a sound pierced the storm, a far-off howl, sharp and rising. A wolf's cry, answered by another. Evelyn's breath caught. She knew the woods were thick with hunger this time of year. Her gaze darted toward the two men by the fire. One stirred in his sleep, as if already listening. The wind rattled the door. The wolves howled again, closer now. Evelyn clutched the blanket tight, her heart thundering, and realized this night's peace was only a fragile beginning. Winter lingered like an unwelcome guest, but days passed, and the rhythm of 3 lives in one cabin settled into something almost natural. Evelyn rose early, her breath steaming in the cold air, and found the taller man. She had learned to call him Dakota, already outside with the axe, his blows steady and unrelenting against the woodpile. The leaner one, Nokos, mended leather or cleaned their blades with quiet precision, his eyes always shifting to the window as if expecting danger. Their presence, once terrifying, had become a strange comfort. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of unspoken trust. But Evelyn's flour ran low, and her thread dwindled. The day came when she could no longer avoid town. She harnessed the old mule, hitched it to the sled, and wrapped herself in her patched shawl. Dakota offered to carry the sacks for her, a simple gesture, yet his hand lingered near her arm as though to steady her. She shook her head. They'll see. Her voice broke, softer than she meant. He did not argue, only stepped back, his eyes unreadable. The road to town wound through snowbound pines, their branches bending low, releasing powder with each gust. Evelyn kept her gaze fixed on the mule's ears, heart heavy with dread. She had not set foot in town since autumn, when Mrs. Gertrude Whitlow had sneered loud enough for all to hear. That Carter girl's wasting away in her father's ghost house. Mark me, she'll not last another winter. The mercantile was warm, thick with the scent of kerosene and spice. Conversation quieted as she entered, as though the door had carried in not only cold but scandal. Mrs. Whitlow herself stood at the counter, her lips curling. "Well, if it ain't little Evelyn," she said, voice dripping with mock sweetness. "We near thought the snow had buried you whole." Evelyn lifted her chin, though her cheeks burned. She asked for flour, salt, beans. The shopkeeper filled her order with polite haste, but his eyes flicked to Mrs. Whitlow, waiting for the spark. It came soon enough. "Heard tell you've got company out there," Mrs. Whitlow said, folding her gloves slowly, savoring the words. "Tall as trees, dark as sin. 2 of 'em. Folks say you took 'em in. Lord above, Evelyn, what sort of girl opens her door to savages?" A murmur rippled through the room. Evelyn's throat closed. She wanted to deny it, to say the storm had forced her hand, but she knew the truth would not matter. They had already decided who she was. "I don't answer to gossip," she managed, her voice small but steady. Mrs. Whitlow laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "You will, girl. This town's eyes are wide, and tongues wag quicker than a creek in spring. Mark me, no decent man will have you now." The words struck deeper than Evelyn wanted to admit. She gathered her goods, hands trembling, and left without looking back. But the whispers followed her out, clinging like burrs. On the sled ride home, the air felt heavier, the trees darker. Her father's grave stood by the cabin, a simple wooden cross weathered gray. She stopped there, her fingers brushing the snow from its surface. "I've shamed us," she whispered, though the wind carried her confession away. When she entered the cabin, Dakota rose at once, searching her face as though reading what the snow itself could not hide. Nokos straightened from the hearth, eyes narrowing. Evelyn placed the sack of flour on the table with too much force, the sound breaking the fragile peace. "They know," she said, her voice breaking. "The whole town. They'll call me ruined." The words hung heavy. Dakota's gaze softened. Not pity, but something deeper, a recognition. He stepped closer, lifting the sack with ease, setting it gently aside as though to strip the shame from her gesture. He did not speak. He only placed the axe, freshly sharpened, against the wall, as if to say, "We stand with you. We will bear it." Evelyn's eyes filled, and she turned away, ashamed of her tears. That night, as the fire glowed low, she broke her silence. "They think me less than decent now. A girl alone with men, and not her kin. They'll whisper I asked for it. That I wanted." Her words faltered, choking in her throat. Dakota did not move, but Nokos shifted, his gaze fixed on her like an arrow. His voice was quiet, low, his English halting. "Shame is their gift. Do not take." The words pierced her more than cruelty ever could. She clutched her shawl around her shoulders, trembling. The cabin seemed smaller, the fire weaker. Days passed, and the judgment of towns seeped into her bones. When she went to the creek for water, she imagined eyes in the trees. When she swept the floor, she heard echoes of laughter from the mercantile. Shame became her shadow, dogging her every step. Yet each time Dakota split wood, each time Nokos mended something broken, a new thread pulled taut inside her, a quiet defiance, though she did not yet name it. One evening, she baked bread with the last of the flour. She set it on the table between them, her hands trembling as she placed her father's knife beside it. Dakota reached for the loaf, but before breaking it, his hand brushed hers deliberately, not by accident this time. Her breath caught, and she dared look at him. His eyes were steady, unflinching, as though to tell her, "You are not what they say. You are more." Her heart thundered with both fear and warmth. She drew back quickly, cheeks aflame, but the gesture lingered like a spark in dry tinder. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake listening to their steady breaths by the fire, and wondered if dignity could be rebuilt not by words, but by these small, silent acts. The next morning, hoofbeats thundered up the frozen path. Evelyn rushed to the window and saw riders. 3 men from town, rifles slung, faces hard with judgment. The mule brayed in alarm. Takota and Nokos rose as one, their bodies tense, eyes narrowing. Evelyn's breath caught. The gossip had left the mercantile. It had come to her door, flesh and blood, and it carried steel. The riders came with the storm. Snow swirled around their horses, cloaks snapping in the wind, rifles dark against the white. Evelyn stood frozen at the window, her breath fogging the glass as hoofbeats pounded closer. The mule reared in its pen, frightened, and the men's voices carried sharp and cold through the blizzard. "Carter girl," one called, the drawl sharp with accusation. "We know who you've got inside." Takota and Nokos stood near the hearth, their bodies taut as drawn bows. Evelyn turned, her hands trembling at her sides. The fire glowed weak behind them, throwing their shadows long and dark against the wall. She felt the weight of their silence, the question hanging in the air. Would they fight, or would they flee? She swallowed, throat dry. "Stay," she whispered, though her voice was barely more than air. The door shuddered as a fist struck it, snow sifting through the cracks. "Best send him out, girl. You don't know what kind of devils you've taken in." Her heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the storm. She saw again Mrs. Whitlow's smirk, the sheriff's warning, the mercantile eyes staring her down. If she let them in, all would be sealed. Her ruin, her shame, their blood. Yet if she sent the men out, they would not return. The cabin would be emptier than it had ever been, stripped of the fragile warmth that had taken root. Takota stepped forward, his scar catching the firelight. He placed one hand on the axe leaning against the wall, but did not lift it. Nokos' eyes narrowed, his hand brushing the knife at his belt. Both men looked to her, not as captains to a soldier, but as wanderers to the one soul who had given them shelter. Her decision would decide all. Another strike at the door rattled the hinges. Evelyn closed her eyes. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she felt her voice rise from somewhere deeper than fear. "Go away," she cried, surprising herself with the strength in it. "There is no devil here but the one in your hearts." Silence fell, sharp and cutting. Then came laughter, low and cruel. "Ruined girl," one muttered. "She's lost already." The hoofbeats retreated, muffled by snow, but Evelyn knew it was no retreat. It was delay. Gossip had now grown teeth, and judgment had found its rifle. Her knees weakened, and she sank into the chair by the fire. Takota crouched before her, his eyes steady, storm-dark. He spoke slowly, his English halting. "They will come again." She nodded, tears burning her lashes. "And I will not be enough to stop them." That night, the storm rose higher, burying the world in white. The wind keened against the walls, shaking the roof with fists of ice. Evelyn lay awake on her narrow bed, but the cabin felt different now. It was no longer her refuge, it was a fortress besieged. She heard Takota and Nokos murmuring low in their tongue, voices like gravel and smoke. She caught only fragments, words she did not know, but tones that spoke of memory, of grief. Unable to rest, she sat up. "Tell me," she whispered into the dark. "What did they take from you?" The firelight glowed on Takota's face as he lifted his gaze. His jaw tightened, and for a long moment she thought he would not answer. Then he said, his voice rough, "My wife. My son. White men came. Promised peace. Brought fire instead. Nokos." He gestured toward his companion. "His brother. His mother. All gone." The air grew heavier, filled with the ashes of his memory. Nokos' eyes glistened, but he said nothing. Evelyn pressed her hand to her mouth, the shame of her town's cruelty burning hotter than the fire. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though the words felt thin, useless. Takota shook his head once. "Storm takes. Fire takes. Men take. Still, we walk." His words lingered, stark and unornamented. Evelyn thought of her own losses. the fever that stole her parents, the town that had abandoned her. Grief was the only thread binding them, yet it was enough to sew some fragile fabric between them. For a long time, none of them spoke. The storm outside shrieked like the dead. Evelyn pulled her shawl tighter, but for the first time, she did not feel alone in her sorrow. The next day, snow lay deep against the cabin walls. The world was quiet, suffocated under white. Evelyn stepped outside, breath fogging the air, her boots sinking with each step. She looked at the fence half buried, the trees heavy with ice. When she turned back, she saw Dakota watching her through the window, his scar catching the pale light, and something shifted in her chest. Not love yet, not desire, but a recognition. He had seen her in her brokenness, and had not turned away. But peace lasted only hours. Toward evening, a shape appeared on the horizon, riders again, their silhouettes stark against the snow. Evelyn's heart stuttered. She rushed inside. "They're coming," she said, breathless. Dakota and Nokos rose at once, their bodies tense. The cabin felt smaller with each passing second, walls closing in, air thick with foreboding. Evelyn moved to the door, but Dakota caught her wrist, his hand hot against her skin. His eyes held hers, dark and steady. "You choose," he said softly. Her breath caught. She realized what he meant. If she opened the door, she would stand with them. If she sent them out, she would be alone again. But spared the judgment, spared the ruin. The hoofbeats grew louder, snow crunching under iron hooves. Voices barked through the storm, harsh and certain. Evelyn's pulse hammered against Dakota's grip. Her shame, her fear, her yearning for dignity, all collided within her, a storm fiercer than the one outside. The door shook with another pounding fist. Evelyn closed her eyes, trembling. When she opened them, Dakota and Nokos were watching her. Not demanding, not pleading, but waiting. As if her choice was the only law they would obey. She drew in a breath, sharp as the snow itself, and lifted the bar from the door. The storm roared in as she pulled it open, lantern light spilling across the snow, revealing rifles pointed straight at her chest. The cold bit at Evelyn's skin as the door swung wide, the storm's fury spilling into the cabin. Rifles glimmered through the snowlight, their barrels steady, aimed at her chest. 3 riders sat astride restless horses, steam rising from manes, faces carved with judgment. Behind her, Dakota and Nokos stood like shadows of stone, their silence heavier than steel. "Step aside, girl." The sheriff's voice cut through the wind, stern and unyielding. "You've no business keeping company with them. They go, or you'll pay the price of their sins." Evelyn's body trembled, though not from the cold. Her shawl whipped about her, her bare toes pressing against the threshold, but she did not move. She thought of the long years of loneliness, of her parents' grave, of Mrs. Whitlow's whispers dripping poison. She thought of the firewood split by Dakota's hand, the chair mended by Nokos, the bread shared in silence. Shame had stalked her like a wolf, but here now, she felt its grip falter. "They stay," she said, her voice low but firm. The words shocked her with their own strength. The sheriff's brows drew tight, snow clinging to the brim of his hat. "Evelyn Carter, you'll damn yourself before God and man alike. No one will take you for decent after this." She straightened, the storm tearing at her hair. "Better to be damned with dignity," she said, her voice steadier now, "than to be praised in cowardice." A murmur rippled among the men. One spat into the snow. "She's gone wild. Let her rot with them." But another shifted, unease flickering in his eyes. They had expected fear, tears, perhaps begging. They had not expected a girl to stand barefoot in a blizzard with fire in her words. Behind her, Dakota stepped forward. In his hand was the axe, its blade sharp, its weight heavy with unspoken promise. But he did not raise it. Instead, he lowered it slowly, laying it into the snow at Evelyn's feet. The gesture was deliberate, solemn. His strength surrendered into her hands. Nokos followed, unclasping the knife from his belt and setting it beside the axe. Both men looked to her as though saying, "We are yours to defend or to condemn. You choose our fate." Evelyn's chest ached with the weight of it. For years she had been invisible, her worth decided by others' whispers. Now 2 men, fierce as storms, placed their lives in her hands. Her fingers curled tight around the shawl. Her breath fogged the air as she bent, grasped the axe, and drove its blade into the frozen ground. The sound cracked like a shot. "They stay," she repeated, louder this time, her voice carried by the storm. The rifles wavered. One rider cursed beneath his breath. The sheriff's jaw hardened. "You've chosen your side, girl. When the town turns its back on you, don't come crying." She held his gaze. The town turned its back long ago. For a moment, no one moved. The snow hissed between them, the fire within the cabin flickering behind Evelyn's small frame. Takota's breath came steady at her back, Noko's eyes sharp as arrows, but neither man stepped forward. It was Evelyn who stood against the rifles, Evelyn who carried the defiance. At last, the sheriff gave a sharp signal. The riders pulled their reins, horses snorting clouds into the storm. They turned, muttering, their figures fading into white until only hoofbeats and curses lingered. The silence that followed was vast, broken only by the whine of the wind. Evelyn's knees nearly buckled as she shut the door. The cabin filled again with warmth, the fire's glow washing over the three of them. She leaned against the wood, breath coming fast, heart pounding in her throat. Her fingers still gripped the haft of the axe. Takota stepped forward, his scar catching the light. His hand brushed hers, gently prying the axe away, setting it once more by the hearth. For the first time his lips curved. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, carved from respect. Nokos bowed his head slightly, the faintest acknowledgement, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. Evelyn pressed her palms to her face, tears slipping hot against her cold skin. Not tears of shame, not wholly of fear, but of release. She had stood in the storm and not broken. Days later, the storm broke, the world draped in unblemished white. Sunlight spilled across the snow, dazzling and pure. Evelyn stood at the doorway, the air crisp, the sky a sharp, endless blue. Takota worked at the fence, Nokos hauled water from the creek. Their movements were quiet, steady, as though nothing had changed. Yet everything had. She watched them, her heart steady now. She was still Evelyn Carter, poor and judged, still the girl whispered about in town. But she was no longer alone, no longer bowed by silence. These men, outcasts like herself, had given her more than protection. They had given her the chance to see her own worth reflected in their small, steadfast acts. That night by the fire, Evelyn broke bread again. She laid it on the table, her hands no longer trembling. When Takota's fingers brushed hers as he took his piece, she did not flinch. Nokos lifted his eyes to hers, and for once, she did not turn away. The cabin glowed with firelight, the storm only a memory. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt the stirrings of something she thought long buried. Not love yet, not belonging entirely, but the seed of both. And she knew it was enough to carry her forward. Later, when the fire had burned low and the men slept, Evelyn sat awake, her gaze on the window. The snow gleamed beneath the moonlight, endless and pure. She thought of the rifles, the laughter, the shame that had nearly smothered her. And she thought of the axe driven into the frozen ground, the sound it made, sharp as truth. Her lips curved into a small, steady smile. She had been invisible once. She would never be again. And as the wind whispered against the cabin walls, Evelyn felt it not as a threat but as a promise. Tomorrow would come, and she would meet it standing. Dear heart, remember this. In a world quick to judge and slow to show mercy, dignity is not given, it is claimed. Sometimes it takes the storm, the rifles, the shame itself to teach us. But if you stand, trembling though you are, you will find that the storm cannot break what is rooted in courage. And in that, you will find yourself whole again.